2 flights below the kitchen, where footfalls softened, a wooden door shut against the dark. A rustle answered the latch. Before we go further, drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if these buried histories pull you in, like the video and subscribe. Because what happened in Virginia in 1851 isn't just one man's fate. It's a blueprint of power turned back on itself. At the edge of a tobacco field near the Appomattox, the house rose with its whitewashed pretense. But the story began beneath it, in a chamber thick with damp earth. The sound was a low, constant drip from joists that sweated in summer heat. The smell was a sour blend of grain, dust, tallow, and cellar mold. The texture underfoot was packed clay, turned slick by spilled brine. She stood alone in that hush, a figure among barrels and salt casks, hands steady over the workbench where hemp twine, a lantern, and a carpenter's auger lay in a tidy row. It had taken a season to make this place listen to her. Tonight, it would obey. The cellar remembers. In the ledger of a property like this, time has a way of repeating itself. Before dawn on August 15th, 1851, inventory had been counted, corn hooped, pork salted, tools tallied, names reduced to lines and values. By evening, the same hand would record the absence of a single rat trap from the shed and wonder where it walked off to. She knew. She had moved it when the overseer's back turned to the weather. Stakes were simple and merciless. Survival against the machine that had measured her life in pounds of cotton and minutes stolen. She could not petition. She could not appeal. She could act. She had tested the cellar's habits as carefully as any doctor studying fever. There was the hour after supper when the hallway lamp above went out, the half-hour lull before the card game started in the parlor, the stretch near 7:15 p.m. when the mastiff dozed outside the back steps, and the precise creak in the third tread of the stairs, a warning you could hear if you held your breath. She counted those beats each night, the way sailors count waves before casting a net. 3 pattern interrupts had shaped her plan. First, a story carried by a mule skinner about a miller downriver who kept rats off his flour with a ring of ash and pepper. Second, a statistic whispered in the quarters that winter, 3 out of every 5 shipments lost a measure to gnawing things before they ever reached Richmond. Third, a memory, childhood evenings in a coastal town far south of here, when scuttling things came bold with darkness and could be lured with lard and offal if you learned the path they trusted. Rats come when called. She had not started with vengeance. She started with numbers. 4 lengths of hemp, each cut to forearm measure. 8 iron staples pried from a broken gate. 2 buckets set with slivers of salt pork and time enough for scent to spread along timbers. The carpenter's auger had made neat holes in a lower wall panel that no one stooped low enough to notice, where an old grain chute met a crawl space. She dusted the sill with flour to read tracks like scripture. They came in pairs, then in clusters, then in a riot of tiny prints that told her exactly how wide to leave the gap. Above ground, the house celebrated a birthday marked each August. In 1851, the count of candles matched a number that meant nothing to her except as a measure of his confidence. He had spent an afternoon at the courthouse, so the stable boy reported speaking of tariffs and hounds and a sale that would tighten up the operation. The boy had not repeated the rest, but she did not need the words. She had heard them in other winters. The operation always tightened around someone smaller. At dusk, she prepared the cellar for its witness, the scrape of iron against wood as she fixed staples into the beams, rendered fat warmed between fingertips, then smeared in thin lines to tell a path. Braided hemp, pulled taut, the bite of fiber burning skin as knots cinched. She did not picture a face. She pictured rules that bodies obey weight and leverage, that doors swing to the side of their hinges, that men who own everything assume no one else can count. A file note, retrieved from a county archive, keeps its own cold grammar. August 15th, 1851. On inspection of premises near Prince Edward Courthouse, found cellar door bar warped and floor abraded by dragging. No sign of forced entry. August 16th. Articles missing: 1 trap, iron, 2 buckets, 1 lantern, minor sundries. August 17th. Employer reports late-night disturbance as of vermin. She had placed the auger down by then and rolled her sleeves without hurry. The house above cracked and sighed as heat bled into night. She marked the minute by the clack of the long case clock in the hall, a sound you could feel through the beams if you pressed your palm flat. The mastiff whuffed once and went quiet. A card snapped on the parlor table. 1 laugh. Then the chair scraped, heavy and final, as he rose with a key. History loves turning points, disguised as simple errands. 3 sections of the plan remained, each built to look like routine. First, the excuse, a cask that stuck and needed a strong hand to shift. Second, the lock that misbehaved since June rains swelled the wood. Third, the storm lantern trimmed to a wick so low it would die to a breath and leave a man blind long enough for the room to close around him. She rehearsed each beat until chance had less and less to say. What would you do if the house that fed you also wrote you down like cargo? At 7:42 p.m. by the courthouse tower bell, she lifted the latch and breathed the cellar air as if tasting a season. Her shoulder brushed the joist she had chalked with a cross. Up the stairs, a tread answered one creak, then another. She snuffed the lantern with 2 fingers, counted 3, and let her eyes learn the dark again. The room gave back its low map. Barrel there, nail keg there, the open mouth of the grain chute where the wall no longer fit flush to stone. She had learned to move like water around the things men notice. Above, the corridor carpet muted the step as he paused to speak to no one. In particular habit, not conversation. Men like him ended their sentences with themselves. The key bit. The lock. The door sang its small hinge song. Cold air sighed against warmer air, the way a swamp exhales after sundown. She already knew the story others would tell, that an accident waited in the dark, that vermin acted as vermin do. But a map is not an accident. It is a decision drawn before anyone sets a foot on it. In the months to come, neighbors would wonder how something so small could undress the order they believed in. The answer lay under their boots, the gnaw beneath the floorboards, the hunger below their tables, the arithmetic she wrote in flour and lard that the county clerk never saw. The cellar learned her name. If this were only revenge, the plan could have happened on any night. But this was about proof. Proof that the ledger, the one that wrote lives as costs and margins, could be edited from below. Proof that a house could swallow its master without a broken lock or a raised shout. That a woman they discounted to a number knew the value of patience better than any man at a courthouse desk. A thing that's watched becomes predictable. Predictable things can be timed. Timed things can be turned. She left one more mark. No one would count. A small scatter of ash in a ring no wider than a dish, just inside the threshold. A trick learned from the mule skinner's tale. The ring kept the first bold scouts puzzled, noses stinging, until her bait told a different story. They would cross when the scent line spoke louder than the ash. They would cross when the room's largest breath had gone out. Between 7:45 and 7:50, the hallway lamp flickered and died. The cellar's dark thickened to wool. She stood where she had chosen to stand 100 times in her mind. One arm hidden along the plank brace, the other at the pulley line she had fitted to the bar. She could hear the keys return to pocket, the weight testing the top stair, the low exhale of a man who believed no one could teach him about fear. The mastiff slept on. Behind the wall panel, the shuffle had become a quiet sea. The scent line did its work. She felt the rope in her palm and let it speak to her bones. Wait, now hold. In the parlor, a card fell. In the yard, a whippoorwill called. In the cellar, the air curved around a shape that filled the doorway and reached for a chain that would move exactly as engineered. It moved. Next, the cellar door swings shut, the bar falls into place, and a house hears what it has never allowed consequences measured in its own darkness. The old stories say, basements keep secrets. This one planned to teach them. The bar fell, wood groaned, and the cellar swallowed sound. Above, cards slapped on a parlor table. Below, silence gathered like breath held too long. Because this was more than one man's punishment, it was a demonstration that centuries of cruelty could meet an answer from the least expected hands. The air inside pressed heavy, soured with spilled brine and grain rot. A lantern guttered once, then died, leaving him blinking into dark he had never noticed before. He called her name, half command, half annoyance, not yet fear. His boots scuffed against packed earth as he reached for the door. That was when he realized the bar lay firm across it. He pulled, rattled, cursed. The cellar gave no answer. The cellar breathes differently when you know you cannot leave. She listened from the shadow of the grain cask. Each sound told her the measure of his growing alarm. The first shout rang sharp, designed to summon help. No help came. Then a pounding, louder, more urgent, that thudded through the beams into the floorboards above. Again, no answer. Laughter in the parlor masked it, or else those who heard simply turned their heads. Neighbors later swore no cry reached their ears. But testimony recorded in a quarter-century-old diary whispered another truth. August 15th, I heard pounding below while supper dishes clattered. I folded linen slower, and slower still. My ears burned, but I did not move. What would you do, standing in a kitchen with a chance to look away? Minutes dragged. He shouted promises, then threats. Promises again. His voice cracked into pleas. She held steady, her hand resting on the pulley cord that tethered to the chute door. Behind the panel, the rustle had grown bold. Small claws tested air. Noses twitched, the gnaw of patience wearing wood to splinters. They knew the scent line she had drawn. They knew the feast waited inside. The house above drifted toward its own rhythm. The overseer, dulled by whiskey, dozed on the porch. The mastiff slept deep. Servants folded sheets by candle. Each knew enough to suspect, but not enough to speak. History's cruelest theater is played before audiences who choose not to see. At 8 o'clock sharp, the courthouse bell tolled across the valley. Its echoes carried into the cellar beams, steady as heartbeat. He pressed his shoulder to the door, straining until the bar creaked. The wood held. He shouted again, hoarse. His boots scraped, found the wall, followed the boards downward, until they struck the lip of the grain chute. That was when his voice broke into something older than command panic. The cellar does not lie. She waited 1 minute longer, long enough to let certainty ferment into terror. Then she pulled the line. The panel clicked, shifted, and opened just wide enough. The rustle became a rush. Tiny bodies poured through, eyes like ink drops catching lantern glow. At first, he laughed. A brittle sound. Rats had plagued cellars before. He would kick them off, stomp them down. But there were too many, drawn by lard, guided by scent, encouraged by hunger, cultivated over days. His laughter bent into curses, then into raw screams muffled by the cellar's low ceiling. She did not flinch. She had counted this moment grain by grain, night by night. Revenge was not an impulse. It was a ledger she balanced with patience. Outside, the evening cooled. In the quarters, workers hushed children to sleep, though the pounding from the big house carried faintly across fields. Some ears caught it, some pretended not to. A choice made by silence. And silence is its own witness. The courthouse record notes nothing that night. But years later, in an aging overseer's deposition, a line slipped through. I heard him call once, then twice, but the bottle kept me still. By the third cry, the night had grown heavy. I let it be. What do you call justice when those who hear refuse to act? By 9 o'clock, the cellar echoed with less struggle. She tightened the line, sealed the chute, and stepped back into darkness. The only sound was the constant gnaw beneath beams that had measured her life in hours and toil. Above, the house went on as though nothing had shifted, but beneath, history had already turned. The cellar remembers. Next, dawn reveals a house that pretends ignorance, a ledger that cannot balance, and a woman who must vanish before the silence breaks. Dawn slipped through the shutters like thin knives of light. Roosters crowed at 5:30 a.m., indifferent to the cellar below. The air outside was cool with dew, smelled of wet earth and hay, and carried the texture of hushed expectation, because by morning, a house built on certainty woke to uncertainty so vast it could not yet be named. In the parlor, cards lay scattered where men had left them. In the dining room, a decanter sweated beside glasses half drained. Upstairs, the mistress stirred with a headache she blamed on August heat. None of them yet asked where he had gone. That absence announced itself more slowly. The cellar held its silence. The bar was still drawn, the panel closed. Rats had scurried back to crawl spaces, bellies heavy. The dirt bore new tracks, too many to count, a palimpsest of hunger. Where a man had been, there remained only remnants that could not be spoken aloud. The cellar leaves fragments she had left before dawn, walking a path memorized in the same patience she had used to study timbers. Her route traced the tree line through dew-soaked grass, past the ash grove where smoke from last winter's fires still lingered in the soil. She carried nothing more than a bundle wrapped in coarse linen, a change of cloth, a heel of bread, and a folded paper marked with forged lines of freedom. At 6 o'clock, the kitchen girl knocked on the cellar door with the morning pail. No answer. She tried again, more firmly, then pressed her ear to the wood. What she heard, she never admitted. Instead, she turned away, returned to her chores, and spoke nothing until questioned. Years later, in testimony preserved in brittle ink, she confessed, "I knew. The quiet was too full. But I set my hands back to washing. If I told, I'd hang with her. If I stayed silent, I might live." What would you have done, spoken the truth, or swallowed it? By 7:30 a.m., whispers threaded the quarters. Someone had seen her shape vanish into the woods. Someone else swore she had walked toward the river road. Others claimed she'd gone nowhere at all, that she still hid inside. Truth fractured into rumor, each piece as sharp as glass. The mistress finally noticed at breakfast. Her husband's chair sat empty. She called for him, voice edged with irritation, not fear. Servants shifted. No one moved to fetch him. Another call, louder. Still no answer. The room chilled, though. August pressed hot outside. By 8 o'clock, her tone sharpened into alarm. She ordered the cellar opened. 2 men drew the bar, lifted the door, and descended. One returned pale as chalk, lips working without sound. The other staggered, retched into the yard. They said nothing coherent, only that the master was gone, entirely gone. The cellar erases certainty. Officials were summoned. A magistrate from Prince Edward County arrived by mid-morning, notebook in hand, already frowning at the gossip. He peered into the cellar, sniffed the air, tapped a cane against the dirt. "Vermin," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed disbelief. "Rats take scraps, not men." And yet the cellar spoke otherwise. Neighbors gathered by noon, their carriages crowding the yard. They murmured in clumps, eyes darting toward the quarters, then away. Some speculated disease. Others whispered witchcraft. None spoke the word justice. That belonged to another vocabulary, one not taught in courtrooms. By 2 o'clock, the house rang with command. Search parties were ordered. Riders scoured river paths. Dogs sniffed the woods. The mistress wailed of abduction, of murder, of enemies plotting against their name. But inside the cellar, the truth lingered, etched in claw marks and disturbed soil. A truth too terrible for polite society to acknowledge. The cellar demands silence. And in that silence, she moved farther away, every step a calculation. She knew the net would spread fast. Dogs, riders, notices. But she also knew panic blurs precision. They would search everywhere except the path marked by patience. She had built her routes like she built her trap, with time, with detail, with a ledger that answered cruelty with craft. What happens to power when its body vanishes without witness? Next, suspicion turns to the quarters. Neighbors tighten their hold, and silence becomes as dangerous as speech. Dawn slipped through the shutters, like thin knives of light. Roosters crowed at 5:30 a.m., indifferent to the cellar below. The air outside was cool with dew, smelled of wet earth and hay, and carried the texture of hushed expectation. Because by morning, a house built on certainty woke to uncertainty so vast it could not yet be named. In the parlor, cards lay scattered where men had left them. In the dining room, a decanter sweated beside glasses half drained. Upstairs, the mistress stirred with a headache she blamed on August heat. None of them yet asked where he had gone. That absence announced itself more slowly. The cellar held its silence. The bar was still drawn. The panel closed. Rats had scurried back to crawl spaces, bellies heavy. The dirt bore new tracks, too many to count, a palimpsest of hunger. Where a man had been, there remained only remnants that could not be spoken aloud. The cellar leaves fragments. She had left before dawn, walking a path memorized in the same patience she had used to study timbers. Her route traced the tree line, through dew-soaked grass, past the ash grove where smoke from last winter's fires still lingered in the soil. She carried nothing more than a bundle wrapped in coarse linen, a change of cloth, a heel of bread, and a folded paper marked with forged lines of freedom. At 6 o'clock, the kitchen girl knocked on the cellar door with the morning pail. No answer. She tried again, more firmly, then pressed her ear to the wood. What she heard, she never admitted. Instead, she turned away, returned to her chores, and spoke nothing until questioned. Years later, in testimony preserved in brittle ink, she confessed, "I knew. The quiet was too full, but I set my hands back to washing. If I told, I'd hang with her. If I stayed silent, I might live." What would you have done, spoken the truth, or swallowed it? By 7:30 a.m., whispers threaded the quarters. Someone had seen her shape vanish into the woods. Someone else swore she had walked toward the river road. Others claimed she'd gone nowhere at all, that she still hid inside. Truth fractured into rumor, each piece as sharp as glass. The mistress finally noticed at breakfast. Her husband's chair sat empty. She called for him, voice edged with irritation, not fear. Servants shifted. No one moved to fetch him. Another call, louder. Still no answer. The room chilled, though. August pressed hot outside. By 8 o'clock, her tone sharpened into alarm. She ordered the cellar opened. 2 men drew the bar, lifted the door, and descended. One returned pale as chalk, lips working without sound. The other staggered, retched into the yard. They said nothing coherent, only that the master was gone, entirely gone. The cellar erases certainty. Officials were summoned. A magistrate from Prince Edward County arrived by mid-morning, notebook in hand, already frowning at the gossip. He peered into the cellar, sniffed the air, tapped a cane against the dirt. "Vermin," he muttered, though his eyes betrayed disbelief. "Rats take scraps, not men." And yet the cellar spoke otherwise. Neighbors gathered by noon, their carriages crowding the yard. They murmured in clumps, eyes darting toward the quarters, then away. Some speculated disease. Others whispered witchcraft. None spoke the word justice. That belonged to another vocabulary, one not taught in courtrooms. By 2 o'clock, the house rang with command. Search parties were ordered. Riders scoured river paths. Dogs sniffed the woods. The mistress wailed of abduction, of murder, of enemies plotting against their name. But inside the cellar, the truth lingered, etched in claw marks and disturbed soil, a truth too terrible for polite society to acknowledge. The cellar demands silence, and in that silence, she moved farther away, every step a calculation. She knew the net would spread fast, dogs, riders, notices. But she also knew panic blurs precision. They would search everywhere except the path marked by patience. She had built her routes like she built her trap, with time, with detail, with a ledger that answered cruelty, with craft. What happens to power when its body vanishes without witness? Next, suspicion turns to the quarters, neighbors tighten their hold, and silence becomes as dangerous as speech. The morning of August 16th broke with a thin mist over the Appomattox. The sound of church bells rang faint from town. The smell of damp hay rose off the fields, and the texture of the ground was soft with dew, where horses pressed new tracks. Because once a master vanished, Virginia's order demanded a spectacle. Someone must be pursued, caught, displayed as proof that control remained unbroken. By sunrise, riders scattered from the plantation yard in all directions. Notices were drafted before breakfast, ink still wet on paper. Runaway, female, near 30 years, 5 feet 4, scar on left palm. A reward was posted, first at $100, then doubled by noon. Courthouse clerks spread the word to ferrymen, innkeepers, and patrols along the James River Road. The hunt had begun. She had prepared for this moment with the same patience she used to measure cellar timbers. Her route curved east, not north, to confuse expectation. She skirted the river lowlands, stepping in marsh reeds to blur her trail. Her shoes were wrapped in rags, soaked with turpentine, a trick learned from field hands to scatter the dogs' noses. Each move was not invention, but memory of whispered strategies passed from one fire circle to another. A mule driver who glimpsed her later wrote in his almanac, August 16th, at the bend near Deep Creek, saw a woman slip through the trees, quick and sure. She carried nothing but her breath. I did not speak. I let the dust close behind her. Would you have spoken or stayed silent? In town, panic spiraled. By midday, taverns brimmed with rumors. Some claimed she carried witchcraft, that rats marched at her bidding. Others swore she was bound for Canada, guided by abolitionists with coded songs. A Richmond Gazette published a line that spread faster than fact. A slave of demonic cunning, armed with nature itself. Fear, once printed, becomes its own authority. Meanwhile, the plantation's overseer joined the search with dogs. They followed a faint trail through pine woods, but lost it at a creek swollen with August rain. He cursed, certain she had doubled back. He did not know she had already crossed 2 ridges east, guided by moss, stars, and the deep patience of someone who had been counting exits for years. The land conceals those who listen. By nightfall, torches dotted roads like constellations brought low. Riders fanned outward, shouting her description at crossroads. Neighbors locked their pantries, chained their kitchens. In one household, every meal was tasted by a servant first, fear sharper than hunger. The poisoner, they said, could be anywhere. The story of the cellar spread until no two tellings matched. In the quarters, silence deepened. Families huddled by candlelight, ears tuned to the night for hoofbeats or shouts. Some prayed for her capture, fearing punishment that might fall on all. Others prayed for her escape, knowing each hour of freedom was a strike against the ledger. Survival demanded both prayers at once. By August 17th, the chase widened to county lines. Dogs bayed along trails that led nowhere. Magistrates in Amelia and Cumberland received word to watch river crossings. Each report blurred into the next sightings that could not be confirmed, whispers that could not be silenced. The hunt feeds rumor. She pressed forward, moving with patience, honed by years of waiting. She knew time was thin, that each dawn made the circle wider. But she also knew panic weakens order. While men shouted of demons and rats, she walked unseen, one step deeper into shadows that had always known her better than the house above. What happens when a story outruns the truth it hunts? Next, newspapers fan fear. The legend grows, and every shadow on the road becomes both threat and possibility. By August 18, 1851, the hunt no longer belonged to one county. The sound of printing presses in Richmond clattered through the night. The smell of hot ink mingled with damp newsprint, and the texture of rumor hardened into headlines. Because once a disappearance entered the papers, it ceased being a local crisis and became a story the entire South told itself. "The vermin witch of Virginia," one gazette declared, its typeset letters sharp with accusation. Another paper whispered of unnatural cunning, insisting she commanded creatures that answered her call. By the time broadsides reached taverns in Petersburg, the tale had grown legs sharper than fact. Patrons swapped details. Some swore she had poisoned wells, others that she carried hex marks scratched into her skin. The story feeds itself. Magistrates leaned on law. Couriers rode into neighboring states with descriptions so embellished they became useless. 5 feet 4 turned to 6 feet. A scarred hand became a missing hand, and her face was painted as everything from ghostly pale to cold dark shadow. Men along crossroads scanned every passerby, certain they would see the poisoner in any tired traveler. Fear, once printed, sees itself everywhere. Meanwhile, the plantation smoldered with suspicion. Overseers accused field hands of hiding her. Threats hissed through cabins, lashings if tongues stayed shut, but no tongue loosened. Silence remained their shield, though silence cut sharp as the lash itself. One testimony, preserved decades later, recalled, "We knew every word could break another neck. So, we said nothing. We folded clothes. We drew water. We let their fear eat itself." What would you have risked speech that condemned, or silence that suffocated? Beyond the fields, she pressed farther east, following tracks of deer through pine and oak. She avoided main roads, traveled at night, and marked direction by stars whispered into her memory from elders long gone. At dawn, she rested beneath brush, thick with dew, listening for dogs, measuring distance by echoes. Hunger pressed her ribs, but patience pressed harder. By the 20th, bounty posters plastered tavern doors and ferry landings. The reward swelled to $500 more than a laborer might see in years. Professional hunters sharpened knives and saddled hounds. Yet each trail dissolved into marsh or ended in river crossings where water swallowed every scent. The land erases when it chooses. In town squares, paranoia sharpened into ritual. One plantation forced servants to taste every dish before a master lifted a spoon. Another household locked its cellar doors with iron bars, though the family had never known a cellar large enough for fear. At night, women crossed themselves against the scratching of common rats in rafters. The legend had infected their ears. Newspapers only deepened the spell. A Petersburg sheet printed that she had already been captured, then retracted it the next day. A Richmond daily claimed she was seen in Baltimore. Each report canceled the last, yet all agreed on one thing: she was dangerous, cunning, and still at large. Fear needs no proof. By the 22nd, patrols extended into swamplands. Riders cursed as horses sank in muck. Dogs whined at trails that dissolved into reed beds. Each failed lead thickened the myth. If she could not be caught, Perhaps she was more than human. Fear made her invisible, and invisibility was her truest disguise. What happens when myth becomes stronger than pursuit? Next, neighbors tighten suspicion to their own kitchens. The overseer grows ruthless, and the line between legend and law begins to blur. By August 24th, 1851, the plantation no longer breathed as it once had. The sound of whips cracked more often than church bells. The smell of sweat mixed with iron on the air, and the texture of each day was coarse, with suspicion that rubbed skin raw. Because when the hunt failed in the woods, blame returned to the yard, and every silence in the quarters became a weapon in overseer's hands. The new overseer, Patterson, arrived with a reputation for cruelty. His voice was gravel. His cane spoke louder than his words. From the first night, he walked the cabins with a lantern, thrusting it into faces, demanding to know where she had gone. Children woke sobbing. Mothers stiffened their backs. Fathers kept eyes lowered. The same answers repeated. We saw nothing. We know nothing. Each repetition brought new fury. Fear burns like dry straw. Patterson turned suspicion into ritual. He forbade gatherings after dusk, posted men to watch the quarters, and ordered food rations cut in half until tongues loosen. He separated children from parents, locking them in the smokehouse by night. The cries carried across the yard like a chorus meant to break wills. Still, no one spoke her name. A neighbor, writing in a ledger, recorded his unease. August 25th. Visited the Whitmore place. Heard naught but silence from the Negroes. Their eyes hard as stone. Overseer cruel. Yet I fear silence more than their words. What would you have chosen, break under cruelty, or hold silence until it burned you hollow? Rumors kept spiraling beyond the plantation. One tavern in Richmond swore that she had slipped onto a schooner bound for Philadelphia. Another claimed she disguised herself as a washerwoman, walking freely under every nose. Patterson seized on each rumor as proof of conspiracy. He dragged men into the yard, forced them to kneel on gravel, demanding names. None came. The quarters hold secrets. But secrets began to cost lives. One boy, no older than 12, collapsed from hunger after 3 days without rations. Another woman, whipped until skin split, whispered nothing but prayers. The cruelty spread like cracks in plaster, visible, jagged, impossible to ignore. Yet through it all, the silence held. They understood. Words could kill more swiftly than hunger. Meanwhile, newspapers painted Patterson as a bulwark of order, firm hand against rebellion, one gazette wrote. They never printed the hunger, the children's cries, the bruises hidden under coarse cloth. The myth of the poisoner had become too useful. It justified cruelty as necessary, safeguard. The law feeds on fear. Still, even Patterson could not stamp out whispers. At night, in cabins muffled by quilts hung over doors, the enslaved shared fragments of what she had done, how she measured every sound, how she used patience as a blade sharper than iron. Her story no longer belonged only to her. It belonged to them, a parable of endurance. By September's first week, fear had twisted the overseer himself. He claimed he heard scratching in the cellar at night. He ordered torches lit, dogs sent down, boards pried up. Nothing. Yet the sound returned each night, gnawing in his imagination until he swore the cellar itself remembered. The cellar does not forget. What happens when cruelty digs too deep and finds only its own reflection staring back? Next, suspicion erupts into open terror. The legend hardens into folklore, and whispers of her fate cross into the realm of myth. By September 10th, 1851, the hunt had cooled, though torches still flickered in distant swamps. The sound of night frogs croaked from marsh beds. The smell of wood smoke clung to air heavy with storm, and the texture of the land itself seemed restless, waiting, because when no body appeared, when no capture was made, the absence hardened into something larger than fact, a story too sharp to silence. Neighbors whispered she had slipped into the James River current, carried north by water that erased every scent. Others swore she joined free black maroons in the dismal swamp, living among cypress and shadow where dogs refused to follow. A newspaper in Baltimore printed that she had been seen boarding a train in disguise. Each rumor contradicted the next, but none could be disproved. The story writes itself. At the plantation, silence grew heavier than speech. Patterson's cruelty faltered under weight of whispers he could not control. Each night, rats still scurried through rafters, gnawing grain sacks, their sounds amplified by fear, until every scratching claw seemed to carry her signature. Children in cabins whispered that the rats obeyed her still, waiting for a command. Mothers hushed them, but the hush carried belief. In Richmond, sermons thundered. One preacher claimed her act proved the devil stalked Virginia's fields. Another quieter voice suggested it was not demons but despair that had taught her patience enough to weaponize hunger. Either way, pews filled with fearful faces. The legend had moved from cellar to pulpit. A field hand's diary entry, decades later, carried the memory. We told the tale like scripture, that she planned and waited and struck when none expected. That silence could be stronger than chains. What would you have carried forward, fear of her, or faith in her defiance? By autumn, bounty posters yellowed in rain. Hunters moved on. But the myth lingered like damp in wood. Children dared each other to creep near the cellar door. Travelers swore they heard scratching beneath floorboards of empty houses. And everywhere, the story found new shape. The slave who fed her master to the rats. The cellar breeds memory. Neighbors who had once boasted of order now locked their kitchens at dusk. Families made servants taste dishes before meals. Fear lived in spoons and cellars, in the imagined sound of claws at night. That fear was her final act, more lasting than disappearance, an invisible leash fastened to the minds of those who had once owned her. What happens when a single act becomes larger than the life that made it? By the year's end, the story no longer belonged to Virginia alone. It traveled by riverboat, by rail, by word of mouth in markets. Each telling changed details but kept the core. A woman wronged, patient beyond measure, who used the smallest creatures to topple the order of a house. And, some said, she was still alive. They swore a woman with a scarred hand worked kitchens in Baltimore, or stitched clothes in Philadelphia, or walked openly in New York beneath a borrowed name. Others claimed she crossed into Canada, where no bounty could follow. None could prove it, yet the uncertainty itself fueled belief. The cellar whispers became legend. Even today, locals in Virginia murmur of an old farmhouse cellar that groans at night. They say if you stand by the door long enough, you'll hear scratching in the walls, not rats, but history gnawing at silence. And so, the legend endures. Next, final reckoning. What traces history leaves, what lessons are buried, and how silence itself becomes the sharpest weapon of all. By winter of 1851, frost rimed the tobacco fields. The sound of crows cracked the sky in black arcs. The smell of smoke from dying fires clung to cabins, and the texture of the soil froze stiff beneath tired feet. Because what began as one night in a cellar had now become a wound stitched into the fabric of Virginia, one that neither overseer nor magistrate could close. The official record listed him only as deceased, circumstances unknown. Courthouse clerks scratched notes into ledgers, but their words dodged the truth. There was no body to bury, no coffin to display, no grave to consecrate. For a man who once counted others as property, he himself ended as absence. His widow wore black, but the veil could not shield her from whispers. At market, women turned their heads. In taverns, men muttered he had been undone by his own household. That shame, more than death itself, was the legacy left behind. The cellar erases names. The quarters endured. Hunger eased when new buyers came, though none could erase what had been seen. or not seen. Stories passed in fragments. She had been patient. She had been deliberate. She had been listening all along. In those retellings, she became more than woman. She became proof that silence could sharpen itself into a blade. Mothers told the story in hushed voices, warning children to be cautious, yet planting seeds of defiance in the telling. One letter from a northern abolitionist, smuggled south, recorded the tale with awe. It is said in Prince Edward that a woman turned vermin against her tyrant. If true, then Providence speaks not by trumpet, but by scratching claw. What would you choose to believe, that she vanished into marshland forever, or that she lived on, shaping history by her absence? By spring, bounty posters peeled from trees, their ink faded by rain, but the legend stayed. Each rat that skittered across a barn beam reminded masters that power was not absolute. Each creak of a cellar door at night recalled that patience can wait years for its moment. Fear, once planted, grows like ivy through walls. The cellar remembers still. In time, neighbors told the tale to frighten children into obedience. Yet in the cabins, the same tale was told as hope that patience, silence, and cunning could topple what chains could not. The dual telling reveals history's paradox. The same story used to terrify one side becomes salvation to the other. And so her act lived beyond her name. Whether she crossed into Canada, walked freely in a city under another name, or vanished into the swamp forever, the truth mattered less than the echo. The story fed itself, sharper with each retelling, a reminder that power can rot from within when silence chooses not to serve. What happens when memory itself becomes the sharpest rebellion? The cellar waits. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.